Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, a fun day to talk about some nifty poetry that I've encountered recently. And today's poem is all about fascism and a hangman. I am referring to The Hangman by Maurice Ogden. For those who don't know, and that would also include me, Maurice Ogden is a poet known for writing The Hangman and also for having lived throughout the 1900s. That's really all I know about this poet. They don't really they have a very big presence online. It is very likely that this poet wrote this poem and that is it. They might have some other poetry that has yet to be encountered or isn't very well publicized, which is unfortunate. What's interesting about this poem is how it shares a lot of similarities to First They Came For by Martin Niemöller, which was published around 1945, which is a very well-known poem. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section. But without further ado, let's talk about The Hangman. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. The Hangman. Into our town the hangman came, smelling of gold and blood and flame, and he paced our bricks with a different air, and built his frame on the courthouse square. The scaffold stood by the courthouse side, only as wide as the door was wide, a frame as tall or little more than capping sill of the courthouse door. And we wondered whenever we had the time, who the criminal, what the crime. The hangman judged with the yellow twist of knotted hemp in his busy fist. And innocent though we were with dread, we passed those eyes of buckshot lead, till one cried, "Hangman, who is he for whom you raise the gallows tree?" Then a twinkle grew in the buckshot eye, and he gave us a riddle instead of a reply. "He who served me the best," said he, "shall earn the rope of the gallows tree." And he stepped down and laid his hands on a man who came from another land. And we breathed again for another's grief. At the hangman's hand was our relief. And the gallows frame on the courthouse lawn by tomorrow's sun would be struck and gone. So we gave him way and no one spoke, out of respect for his hangman's cloak. The next day's sun looked mildly down on a roof and street in our quiet town, and stark and black in the morning air, the gallows tree on the courthouse square. And the hangman stood at his usual stand, with the yellow hemp in his busy hand, with his buckshot eye and jaw like a pike, and his air so knowing and businesslike. And we cried, "Hangman, have you not done yesterday with the alien one?" Then we fell silent and stood amazed. Oh, not for him was the gallows raised. He laughed a laugh as he looked at us. "Did you think I'd gone to all this fuss to hang one man? That's a thing I do to stretch the rope when the rope is new." Then one cried murderer, one cried shame, and into our midst the hangman came, to that man's place. "Do you hold," said he, "with him that was meet for the gallows tree?" And he laid his hand on one's arm, and we shrank back in quick alarm, and we gave him way and no one spoke, out of fear of his hangman's cloak. That night we saw with dread surprise, the hangman's scaffold had grown in size, fed by the blood beneath the chute, the gallows tree had taken root. Now as wide or little more than the steps that led to the courthouse door, as tall as the writing, or nearly as tall, halfway up on the courthouse door. The third he took, and we all heard tell, was a usurer and infidel. "And what," said the hangman, "have you to do with the gallows bound, and he a Jew?" And we cried out, "Is this one he who has served you well and faithfully?" The hangman smiled, "It's a clever scheme, to try the strength of the gallows beam." The fourth man's dark accusing song had scratched our comfort hard and long, and what concern he gave us back have you for the doomed and black. The fifth, the sixth, and we cried again, Hangman, is this the man? It's a trick, he said, that we hangman know for easing the trap spring slow. And so we ceased and asked no more, as the hangman tallied his bloody score, and sun by sun and night by night, the gallows grew to a monstrous height. The wings of the scaffold opened wide, till they covered the square from side to side, and the monster crossbeam looking down, cast its shadow across the town. Then through the town the hangman came and called in the empty streets my name, and I looked at the gallows soaring tall and thought, there is no one left at all for hanging, and so he calls to me to help pull down the gallows tree, and I went out with right good hope to the hangman's tree and the hangman's rope. He smiled at me as I came down to the courthouse square through the silent town, and supple and stretched in his busy hand was a yellow twist of the hempen strand. And he whistled his tune as he tried the snap, and it sprang down with a ready snap. And then a smile of awful command, he laid his hand upon my hand. You tricked me, hangman, I shouted then, that your scaffold was built for other men, and I'm no henchman of yours, I cried. You lied to me, hangman, foully lied. Then a twinkle grew in the buckshot eye. Lied to you, tricked you, he said, not I. For I answered straight and I told you true, the scaffold was raised for none but you. For who has served more faithfully than you with your coward's hope, said he. And where are the others that might have stood side by side in the common good? Dead, I whispered, and amiably murdered, the hangman corrected me. First the alien, then the Jew. I did no more than you let me do. Beneath the beam that blocked the sky, none had stood so alone as I. And the hangman strapped me, and no voice there cried stay for me in the empty square. In terms of analysis, this is a very interesting poem. The Hangman, in terms of narrative, the Hangman focuses on a very simple story. A hangman shows up to a town threatening to hang somebody, and only the hangman is going to hang somebody who has served him well. But as the story progresses, we see the hangman is hanging multiple people, and eventually the people stop questioning it because the hangman is retaliating against those who question what he is doing. Eventually, the only person left is the narrator, and then the hangman points out, you have served me faithfully because you just let this all happen. And the narrator laments that no one is left to call out and cry about this crime that is taking place, and this person too dies. Presumably, the hangman goes on to other towns to do this exact same thing. What's interesting about this poem is, there's a lot that you can parse from it, but one thing that stood out to me in particular is how in the initially when the hangman is hanging people, the people say, oh, we're not going to say anything out of respect for his hangman's cloak. Is that really respect, though? Because you know that if you say anything about the hangman, he'll probably hang you. It becomes more apparent later in a later verse. The narrator says, and he laid his hand on the one's arm, and we shrank back in quick alarm. And we gave him way, and no one spoke out of fear of his hangman's cloak. And that's interesting because it shows that initially they didn't respect the hangman. They feared him. And as more people are hung, this fear becomes apparent that they're not going to say anything because those who deliver justice are viewed with an aura of fear more than anything else. And what stops us from saying anything about injustice is the fear that we might be next. And that's a very necessary kind of notion in this poem that I respect Maurice Ogden for writing, because it's we put police on a pedestal and we say that they're great and whatnot, but I don't think we actually believe that they're great or respect them in the same way. We just fear that one day we'll be on the other end of a gun or a bullet or of the justice system, and if we don't show the proper respect, we might not get a fair shake. But the joke is, no one really gets a fair shake in a fascist system. And you could take this poem literally, but I don't think that's what Maurice Ogden is getting at. Much like how with First They Came For by Martin Himmler, the poem is meant to symbolize the effects of fascism. How first they come for the most vulnerable members of society, and we don't do anything because we are not members of those society, or we might not be associated with them. But eventually they come for the rest of us. They come for the people who are not so vulnerable. And because you did not say anything for those people, because you did not speak out against the metaphorical hangman, like, it's so easy for them to get you, because there's no one left to speak out for you. There's only you. There's only people like you, and those people are all being gathered up and arrested. What I especially like is how at the end of the poem, the hangman says, "I did no more than I let you do," suggesting that we all have a part to play in this. And much more so than First They Came For, it shows that there's blood on the narrator's hands here, that by allowing these other crimes to happen, and by saying, "I did no more than you let me do," it kind of indicates that we have the power to stop fascism, but by not doing so, we are held responsible in some way. So kind of more direct responsibility there, which I really like. That's what speaks to me about this poem, and the shame that the narrator feels when they realize that they let people die, but also no one's coming to save them is pretty horrifying. And as much as people like to say that we're built in a system of laws that can't be changed, they often can be changed by those who have power and those who abuse power. But also the people are very much in control of the situation. If they decide that they're not going to tolerate fascism anymore, they can rise up. But by allowing all this to happen, they're facilitating the rise and eventual normalization of the fascist system. So a lot worth chewing on there. And I feel like you could, again, go through this poem and examine it a little bit more, but that would take forever, and that's not the intention of Poetry Thursday. It's meant to be quick looks, but this is a pretty long poem, so I had to spend a bit more time on it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Hangman by Maurice Ogden, a pretty solid poem that is worth reading. I'm going to put a link to it in the description. If you read this before, you simply have some comments on the poem, say something below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or possibly join our Discord so that more people can find out about this poem or other readings that we do or other Poetry Thursday related stuff. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and anti-fascist travels. Farewell.